Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Skull and Hats Tales. I'm always curious to know where the people who watch this channel are from. So before you relax, consider leaving a comment. Now, let's get started. It was just past dusk when I noticed the figure near the side of my house. I had been idly flipping through channels when movement outside the window caught my eye. At first, I thought it was a trick of the fading light, but as I leaned closer, I saw him. He was crouched near the electrical box, his silhouette faintly illuminated by the glow of a street lamp across the road. His movements were deliberate, precise, as if he were working on something. I watched, frozen, unsure of what to do. The figure wasn't wearing a uniform or anything that suggested he was a repairman. He looked ordinary, dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured by the angle. Before I could decide whether to confront him or call someone, he stood abruptly, glancing around as if sensing he was being watched. Then, without a word, he slipped into the shadows, disappearing into the night. I stayed at the window for a long moment, my heart racing. Was he tampering with the box? Or was it something innocent, like a mistake or a repair I hadn't been notified about? Eventually, I convinced myself it wasn't worth overthinking. Maybe it was a mix-up, or maybe he wasn't doing anything malicious. Still, a sliver of unease lingered as I returned to my routine. A few days later, the incident had almost faded from my mind. It was a quiet evening, and I was enjoying the stillness of the house, the hum of appliances a comforting backdrop to the silence. That's when it happened. The lights flickered once, then twice, before plunging the entire house into darkness. I froze, staring into the sudden void. The hum of appliances had stopped, leaving a silence that felt almost suffocating. I checked my phone, hoping the outage was local, but a quick glance out the window told me otherwise. The streetlights were still on, their pale glow casting long shadows on the road. My unease from days earlier came rushing back. I thought of the man near the electrical box, his shadowy figure crouched in the dim light. The coincidence felt too stark to ignore. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the electrical box. The darkness of the house pressed down on me as I moved through it, the faint creak of the floorboards underfoot making me jump. Outside, the cool air hit me like a slap, amplifying the stillness of the night. The electrical box looked ordinary at first glance. I opened it cautiously, my flashlight illuminating the wires inside. But as I leaned closer, my breath caught. The wires had been deliberately cut, the ends clean and precise. This wasn't an accident or the work of time, it was intentional. My mind raced. Who would do this? And why? The memory of the figure I'd seen days ago flashed vividly in my mind. My stomach tightened as I realized he must have been tampering with the box that night, setting up for this moment. A sound pulled me from my thoughts. A faint rustle, too deliberate to be the wind. I spun around, the beam of my flashlight slicing through the dark. My yard was empty, the trees swaying gently in the breeze, but the feeling of being watched was unmistakable. I turned back to the box, my hands shaking as I tried to think of what to do next. I needed to get back inside, to call someone, anyone, to help. But before I could move, a shadow detached itself from the edge of the house and stepped into view. The figure was closer now, just beyond the edge of my flashlight's beam. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it was the same man I'd seen before. He stood there, motionless, his face obscured in shadow. He didn't speak, didn't move. He just watched. Then, with a deliberate slowness that made my skin crawl, he took a step toward me. Panic surged through me. I dropped the flashlight and ran, the beam spinning wildly as it hit the ground. My feet pounded against the dirt as I reached the door, fumbling with the handle before finally yanking it open. I slammed it shut behind me, the lock clicking into place with a satisfying finality. For a moment, I leaned against the door, gasping for air, my ears straining for any sound outside. Then I heard it, the faint crunch of footsteps circling the house, slow and deliberate. My stomach churned as I realized he wasn't leaving. He was waiting. I grabbed my phone with trembling hands and dialed the police, my voice shaking as I explained what had happened. The operator assured me help was on the way, but the minutes felt like hours as I waited, listening to the haunting sound of footsteps circling my home. I sat in the dark, clutching my phone as I listened to the steady crunch of footsteps outside. They weren't hurried or random. They were measured, deliberate, circling the house with an almost maddening rhythm. My heart raced as I tried to track the sound, but it seemed to move in every direction at once, as if the figure was testing each corner of the house. A faint rattle at the back door made me jump. My eyes darted toward the kitchen, where the sound came again, a soft, deliberate jiggle of the handle. My pulse quickened. I thought about shouting, but the fear that it would provoke him into action kept me silent. The footsteps moved again, this time toward the windows. I hurried to lock the last of them, drawing the curtains tightly. As I passed by the living room, I saw a faint shadow outside, crossing briefly in front of the curtain. My knees felt weak as I pressed myself against the wall, trying to steady my breathing. The footsteps stopped suddenly. The silence was suffocating. I strained my ears, every nerve on edge, but there was nothing, just the stillness of the house and the faint hum of my own terror. And then a loud bang came from the back of the house. It wasn't subtle or testing. It was a full, deliberate strike, as though he were trying to break something down. I scrambled to the hallway, my mind racing. The bang came again, reverberating through the house. My phone trembled in my hands as I called the police back. "He's trying to get in," I whispered frantically. "Please, tell them to hurry." The operator's calm voice tried to reassure me, but her words felt distant. All I could focus on was the growing tension in the air. The banging stopped, replaced by a faint scraping noise, like something being dragged along the walls outside. It moved slowly, circling the house once more, as though the intruder was searching for another way in. I crouched near the front door, my hands gripping the phone so tightly it hurt. The thought of him breaking in was unbearable, but equally terrifying was the thought of what he would do if he succeeded. Suddenly the scraping stopped, and the silence returned. My breathing was loud in the stillness, every second stretching into an eternity. I imagined him standing just outside, watching, waiting. The minutes felt endless, but finally the sound I'd been praying for arrived, the distant wail of sirens. Flashing lights flooded the yard, their harsh glow spilling through the curtains. Relief surged through me as I heard the car doors slam and the heavy footsteps of officers approaching the house. I unlocked the door, my hands trembling, and practically threw it open. 2 officers stood there, their flashlights already scanning the perimeter. "He's still out there," I stammered. "He was trying to get in." They nodded and split up, one staying with me while the other circled the property. I clutched the doorframe, watching as their beams cut through the night. I half expected to see the figure jump out from the shadows, but nothing happened. The officer returned after a few minutes, shaking his head. "No sign of anyone," he said, though his tone carried a hint of unease. "But your electrical box has definitely been tampered with. We'll take a look around the area." I pointed toward the woods beyond the backyard, where the darkness felt even more impenetrable. "He could have gone that way." The officers nodded and began sweeping the area with their flashlights. For a moment, the house felt almost safe. But then I noticed the footprints. They led from the electrical box to every window and door, stopping at the places where I had heard him. The sight of them sent a chill down my spine. He had been everywhere. The officers finished their search and returned to the house. "Whoever it was is gone," one of them said. "We'll file a report and increase patrols in the area. But for now, make sure to secure your home." I thanked them, though their words did little to ease my nerves. As the patrol car drove away, the house felt emptier than ever. The quiet returned, oppressive and unnerving, as though the night itself had been complicit in what happened. It was late, the kind of hour when the world feels emptied out, leaving only silence and faint echoes of the day. I pulled into the supermarket parking lot, choosing a spot near a streetlight, even though the lot was mostly empty. The glow of the light above cast long shadows, making the space feel even larger and more deserted than it was. As I stepped out of my car, I felt it, a strange awareness, like the air had shifted. I glanced around, scanning the lot. That's when I saw him. At the far edge of the lot, barely illuminated by the faint halo of a distant light, a figure stood motionless. He wasn't walking toward me, nor was he leaving. He was just standing there, facing my car. I froze for a moment, gripping my keys. My mind scrambled for explanations. A late-night walker, a loiterer, maybe someone waiting for a ride. But something about the stillness of his posture and the way his attention seemed fixed on me unsettled me deeply. I hesitated, then turned toward the store, trying to shake off the unease. My steps quickened, and I avoided looking back until I was inside. The bright fluorescent lights of the supermarket were a stark contrast to the eerie stillness of the lot. I grabbed a basket and tried to focus on my shopping list, but my mind kept drifting to the figure outside. Who was he? Why was he just standing there? I couldn't help myself. As I moved through the aisles, I glanced toward the store's front windows, scanning the parking lot. He was still there, standing in the same spot, his form barely visible through the glass. I took a deep breath and tried to brush it off. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe he wasn't even looking at me. But when I returned to my car with the groceries, my pulse quickened. The figure was still there, closer now. He had moved a few rows forward, but still stood at a distance, perfectly still, facing me. My hands shook as I loaded the groceries into the trunk. I kept glancing up, expecting him to move, to walk away, to do something. But he didn't. I slid into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and drove away without looking back. The next few times I went to the supermarket, I couldn't help but think about him. I told myself it was nothing, a coincidence, maybe someone waiting for a friend or a ride. But the sense of unease lingered, and I found myself scanning the lot each time I parked. And then I saw him again. This time, he was positioned near the entrance, not far from where I parked. He didn't approach, didn't speak. He just stood there, watching. I tried to act normal, walking into the store with my head down, but my heart raced the entire time. Inside, I couldn't focus. I wandered the aisles aimlessly, glancing over my shoulder as though he might suddenly appear behind me. When I left, he was back at the edge of the lot, standing a few rows away from my car. The pattern repeated on my next visit and the next. Each time he was there, his position slightly different, but always within sight. I debated telling someone, security, the store manager, but what could I say? A man keeps standing in the parking lot. It sounded ridiculous. Still, the unease grew. It wasn't just him. It was the silence, the stillness, the way the empty lot felt suffocating whenever he was there. One evening, I saw him standing even closer. He was just a few spots away from where I parked, his dark clothing blending into the shadows. My breath caught in my throat as I got out of the car, clutching my keys tightly. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge me, but I could feel his eyes on me. Inside the store, I wandered the aisles, hyper-aware of every person around me. My nerves were raw, and I jumped at the smallest sounds. Halfway through my shopping, I turned a corner and saw him. He wasn't close, but he was there, a few aisles over, moving slowly and deliberately. My chest tightened as I ducked behind a shelf, peeking out to watch him. He didn't look at the shelves, didn't pick up anything. He was just there. I abandoned my half-full basket and hurried to the checkout, my mind racing. When I returned to my car, he was back in the parking lot, standing near the light pole I had parked under. His posture was the same, rigid, unyielding, focused. I didn't wait. I loaded my groceries quickly, locked the car, and sped off, my hands trembling on the wheel. My headlights swept across him as I drove past, and for the first time, he turned his head slightly, as if to watch me leave. It had been a few days since the last encounter, and though the unease hadn't left me, I convinced myself to return to the supermarket. Maybe I was imagining things, I thought. Maybe he wasn't there at all, and I had just been scaring myself. This time, I parked farther from the store, near the side entrance, hoping to avoid seeing him. As I walked toward the building, my heart pounded, and I kept glancing over my shoulder. The parking lot seemed quiet, ordinary. I began to relax. Inside, I grabbed a basket and wandered the aisles, carefully sticking to my list. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. But as I approached the checkout, a feeling of dread crept over me. I couldn't explain it, just an overwhelming sense that something was wrong. I stopped near the large front windows to glance at the parking lot, and my blood ran cold. My car was surrounded. At least 5 figures stood in a loose circle around it, their silhouettes faintly illuminated by the streetlights. They weren't moving, just standing there, their heads turned slightly toward the car. My chest tightened as I scanned the lot, hoping for an explanation, but there was none. It was them, the same man I'd seen before, and others like him. I felt trapped. There was no way I could go back to the car, not with them standing there like that. My hands trembled as I clutched my basket, my thoughts racing. Should I call the police? Should I tell someone in the store? I turned, my legs weak, and headed deeper into the aisles. My breaths came in shallow gasps as I made my way to the back of the store, away from the windows and the parking lot. I wasn't sure what to do. I couldn't leave through the front doors, not with them standing there. My only option was to find another exit. I spotted an employee stacking shelves and approached them, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is there a back exit I can use?" I asked. The employee raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Yeah, near the stock room. It's for employees, though." I nodded quickly, murmuring something about feeling sick and needing fresh air. They didn't press further, gesturing toward the back of the store. I hurried in that direction, my pulse pounding in my ears. The stockroom was dimly lit, and the exit sign above the door cast a faint glow. I pushed the door open, stepping into the cool night air. The alley behind the store was quiet, empty, and for the first time in hours, I felt a sliver of relief. I moved quickly, keeping to the shadows, circling the building until I reached a side street. My car was still in the lot, but I couldn't bring myself to go back for it, not with them there. I walked briskly down the street, calling a rideshare as I put as much distance between me and the store as possible. My phone felt slippery in my trembling hands as I typed in my address. When the car arrived, I slid into the back seat, glancing nervously at the rearview mirror. The ride home was silent, but every shadow we passed felt heavier, darker, as if they were watching me even now. The next day, I contacted the store to report what had happened, though I left out the part about being followed over multiple visits. The manager was polite but dismissive, suggesting it might have been a prank or a group of loiterers. I hung up, feeling more frustrated than before. I avoided the supermarket entirely after that, choosing a different store on the other side of town. Even so, the unease followed me. I started noticing things. A car parked across the street from my house that I didn't recognize, a man standing at the corner who seemed to turn away whenever I looked at him. At night, I kept the curtains drawn and double-checked the locks on my doors and windows. I wanted to believe it was over, that I was imagining things, but the sense of being watched never left. One evening, as I was heading out to run errands, I noticed a folded piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. My hands shook as I opened it. It was blank, save for a single line written in neat, black ink, "We see you." The note sent me spiraling. I stayed inside for days, unwilling to risk another encounter. But the silence in my house was no comfort. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows, felt like a warning. I started leaving lights on at all hours, convinced that darkness would invite them closer. A week passed before I dared leave again. I went to a different supermarket, parking close to the entrance and keeping my visit short. It was supposed to be a simple hike, a way to clear my head and escape the monotony of daily life. The forest was dense but beautiful, sunlight barely piercing the canopy above. The air smelled of earth and moss, the path beneath my boots soft and damp from recent rain. I had been walking for hours, enjoying the solitude, when I saw it, the shack. It was tucked away in a thicket of trees, almost hidden by the dense undergrowth. At first, I thought it was just a cluster of rocks or a particularly large bush, but as I got closer, the outline of a structure became clear. The wood was old and weathered, the roof sagging slightly in the middle. Vines crawled up its walls like veins, and the door hung slightly ajar, swaying faintly in the breeze. I hesitated. The place looked abandoned, forgotten by time, but something about it drew me closer. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the simple desire to find something unexpected. Whatever the reason, I stepped off the trail and moved toward the shack. As I approached, a strange sense of unease began to build. The closer I got, the quieter the forest seemed to grow, as if it were holding its breath. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, the sound unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. Inside, the shack was dim, the air thick and stale. My flashlight illuminated a cramped, cluttered space. At first glance, it seemed empty, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized the place was far from abandoned. Torn clothing lay scattered across the floor, as though someone had ripped through their belongings in a frenzy. Some pieces were caked with dirt, others stained with something darker. A rusted bed frame sat in one corner, its mattress shredded, the springs exposed and warped. Old photographs were strewn across a small table, their edges curled and yellowed with age. The faces in the photos were blurred, as though the images had been damaged over time, or intentionally obscured. The walls were covered in strange carvings, symbols scratched deep into the wood. They didn't look like anything I recognized, neither letters nor pictures, just jagged, chaotic shapes. A faint metallic smell hung in the air, mixing with the scent of mildew and decay. My skin prickled as I stepped further inside. Everything about the shack felt wrong, as if I were intruding on a place that wasn't meant to be seen. I moved cautiously through the room, careful not to disturb anything. The symbols on the walls seemed to writhe in the flashlight's beam, their jagged edges casting eerie shadows. My eyes were drawn to the photographs. Most of them were of people, some standing stiffly, others caught in blurred motion. But there was something off about them. The faces were smudged, indistinct, as though someone had tried to erase their features. In one photo, a group of people stood in front of a forest, their expressions unreadable. Something about the image felt eerily familiar, but I couldn't place it. Another photo showed a single figure standing alone in the woods, their back turned to the camera. I picked it up, feeling an inexplicable chill as I studied it. That's when I heard it, a faint creak from the floorboards behind me. I spun around, my flashlight darting across the room, but there was nothing there. The shack was empty, or at least it appeared to be. My heart pounded as I stepped back toward the door. The air felt heavier now, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in. I had seen enough. As I stepped outside, the forest greeted me with a chill that hadn't been there before. The sunlight filtering through the trees seemed weaker, casting long, twisted shadows across the ground. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. The shack's presence lingered in my mind. Its strange contents burned into my memory. I started walking back toward the trail, but the forest felt different now. The trees seemed closer together, their branches reaching down like skeletal fingers. The air was thick and still, the usual sounds of birds and insects conspicuously absent. Then I heard it, a faint rustling sound coming from somewhere behind me. It was subtle at first, barely audible, but it grew louder as I quickened my pace. Leaves crunched underfoot, twigs snapped in the distance, and a high-pitched squeal cut through the silence. It wasn't an animal. It was something else. Something unnatural. I froze, straining to pinpoint the source of the noise. It seemed to come from all directions at once, echoing through the trees. My pulse raced as the sounds grew louder, closer. The squeals turned into guttural grunts, accompanied by rapid, uneven footsteps. I didn't wait to see what was making them. Panic surged through me as I broke into a run, my only thought to get as far from the shack, and whatever was following me, as possible. My legs moved before my mind could fully process the sounds behind me. The guttural grunts and squeals grew louder, joined by the chaotic snapping of branches and crunching of leaves. Whatever was back there wasn't just following me, it was closing the distance fast. The forest was a blur as I ran, my breath ragged and sharp in the cold air. The path I'd come in on was nowhere to be found, swallowed by the oppressive tangle of trees and undergrowth. Every step seemed to take me deeper into the forest's grasp, the terrain becoming more uneven and treacherous. I glanced over my shoulder, just for a second, and caught a glimpse of movement. Dark shapes darting between the trees, their forms indistinct but terrifyingly fast. My foot caught on a root, and I stumbled, barely catching myself before hitting the ground. The impact jarred me, and for a moment the world spun. The noises were even closer now. Whatever was following me wasn't trying to stay hidden anymore. The squeals turned into a kind of maddening chorus, their chaotic rhythm echoing through the woods. I pushed myself harder, my legs burning, my lungs screaming for air. The forest around me seemed alive, the shadows twisting and shifting as if they were part of the chase. The sound of footsteps was deafening, pounding through my ears in sync with my own racing heartbeat. The flashlight in my hand flickered, its beam faltering as I pushed through the thick underbrush. I couldn't afford to stop, couldn't even think about what would happen if the light failed completely. The trees were closing in, their branches clawing at my clothes and skin as I barreled forward. The footsteps behind me suddenly stopped. I froze mid-stride, my ears straining to catch the faintest sound. The silence was absolute, crushing. For a brief moment, I thought I'd outrun whatever it was. But then I heard it, a faint, wet noise, like something being dragged across the forest floor. It was close, far closer than I'd realized. The flashlight's flickering beam caught something in the corner of my vision, a dark, hunched shape shifting between the trees. My stomach lurched as I realized it wasn't alone. More shadows moved in the periphery, circling, their movements erratic and disjointed. A low growl echoed from somewhere to my left, followed by another from the right. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body felt paralyzed, locked in place by sheer terror. Then the dragging sound came again, closer now, accompanied by a guttural grunt that sent a chill racing down my spine. Something snapped inside me. I turned and bolted, my legs carrying me blindly through the darkness. The forest thinned suddenly, the dense trees giving way to a clearing bathed in faint moonlight. Relief surged through me as I saw an opening ahead, a dirt path leading to what looked like the trailhead. My muscles burned as I pushed myself harder, desperate to reach the safety of open ground. The noises behind me didn't relent. The footsteps and squeals had returned, louder and more frantic, as though whatever was chasing me knew its prey was slipping away. I didn't dare look back. I didn't need to. I could feel them, multiple presences, their weight pressing down on the air around me. As I broke through the clearing, the noises stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. I stumbled onto the trail, my chest heaving, and risked a glance over my shoulder. The edge of the forest was dark and still, the shadows under the trees unnaturally deep. Whatever had been following me was gone, or at least hidden, watching from the safety of the woods. I didn't wait to find out which. I staggered down the trail until I saw the faint glimmer of my car in the distance. Relief flooded through me as I reached it, fumbling with the keys and collapsing into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, and I didn't stop to think. I just drove, the forest disappearing into the rearview mirror. It was late, and I was exhausted. The day had dragged on far longer than it should have, and all I wanted was to get home. Hailing a cab seemed like the easiest option. The streets were quiet, the occasional car passing by under the dull glow of streetlights. The cab pulled up quickly after I raised my hand. The driver, a middle-aged man with a nondescript face, gave a polite nod as I climbed into the back seat. His eyes lingered a little too long in the rearview mirror as he asked, "Where to?" I gave him my address, settling back into the seat, trying to ignore the faintly musty smell of the upholstery. At first, the ride seemed normal. He made light conversation, small talk about the weather, the lateness of the hour. It was unremarkable, the kind of banal chatter that I'd heard countless times before. But something about his tone made me uncomfortable. It wasn't what he said, but how he said it, too deliberate, as though he were trying to gauge my reactions. I brushed it off, focusing instead on the blurred city lights outside. After about 10 minutes, I noticed something odd. The streets we were driving through didn't look familiar. We had veered off the main road and were now heading down narrower, poorly lit streets. The buildings became sparser, the spaces between them stretching longer. "Hey, isn't this the long way?" I asked, leaning forward slightly. The driver glanced at me through the rearview mirror, his expression neutral. "Traffic ahead," he said curtly. "This way's faster." I frowned. The streets were practically deserted. What traffic? I debated pressing the issue, but decided against it, telling myself there might be a detour I didn't know about. Still, unease began to creep in. The glow of the streetlights was fading, replaced by stretches of darkness that felt heavier with each passing moment. The driver's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles pale. He wasn't humming or tapping to the faint radio music like most drivers would. The silence in the car grew thick, suffocating. "Do you live alone?" he asked suddenly, his voice breaking the quiet. The question caught me off guard. I blinked, unsure if I'd heard him correctly. "Excuse me?" Just curious, he said, his tone too casual. It's late. I figure someone must be waiting for you, right? I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. Yeah, someone's waiting, I lied. He nodded but didn't respond. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror again, meeting mine briefly. I tried to look unaffected, but my heart was racing. The casual tone of his question felt anything but casual. You work nearby? He asked, his voice a little softer now. Yes, I replied tersely, trying to keep my answers short. What do you do? He pressed. I didn't answer immediately, glancing out the window as the buildings grew fewer and the streets darker. I work in an office, I said finally. He nodded again, his gaze lingering in the mirror. Must be a quiet job, huh? Something about the way he phrased it made me feel exposed, like he was trying to piece me together in his mind. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, gripping my bag a little tighter. The car slowed slightly as we approached a bend, the road narrowing ahead. The driver's tone shifted as he spoke again. What's the scariest thing that's ever happened to you? My stomach dropped. Why do you ask? He chuckled, but it was a cold, humorless sound. Just curious. People get in this car all the time. They tell me the strangest things. I didn't respond, my body tensing as I watched the road ahead. The streetlights were few and far between now, the shadows stretching long and deep. The car felt like a trap, the air thick with tension. Do you scare easily? He asked, his voice low. I forced myself to meet his eyes in the mirror. Why are you asking me this? He smiled, a small, almost imperceptible curve of his lips. No reason, just trying to pass the time. The car slowed even more as we rounded a bend. My heart raced as I realized how far we were from any familiar landmarks. The buildings were gone now, replaced by empty lots and overgrown fields. The road was deserted, the kind of place where no one would hear you scream. Panic surged through me as the car crawled to a near stop. I glanced at the door handle, my mind racing. This was my chance. The car slowed further as it rounded the bend, the wheels crunching against loose gravel on the roadside. My pulse thundered in my ears as I gripped the door handle, willing myself to stay calm. I could feel the driver's gaze through the rearview mirror, his eyes sharp and calculating. This part of town gets real quiet, he said, his voice low and almost conversational. Not many people come through here. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. My fingers tightened around the handle as the car crawled to a near stop. The air inside felt suffocating, the weight of his words pressing down on me. The dim headlights illuminated nothing but empty road and encroaching trees. There were no houses, no passing cars, no sign of help. The driver reached for something on the dashboard, a notepad perhaps, or a phone, but the motion was enough to spur me into action. Without giving myself time to think, I yanked the door handle and shoved the door open. The rush of cold night air hit me as I jumped out, my foot slipping on the gravel. Pain shot through my ankle as I hit the ground hard, the impact jarring my knees and elbows. Behind me, I heard the screech of brakes as the cab came to a full stop. Adrenaline drowned out the pain as I scrambled to my feet. The driver's door slammed shut, and I heard him call out, his tone sharp and angry. Hey, what the hell are you doing? I didn't look back. My legs moved on instinct, carrying me away from the cab and toward the darkened tree line at the side of the road. My breath came in shallow, frantic gasps as I pushed myself forward, every muscle in my body screaming to escape. Behind me, his footsteps echoed, quick and heavy, crunching against the gravel. Stop! He yelled, the sound cutting through the stillness of the night. You'll get yourself hurt out here. His voice was too close, too calm. I veered off the road, plunging into the underbrush. Branches tore at my clothes and scratched my arms as I forced my way through the trees. The faint light from the road disappeared, replaced by an oppressive darkness. I could still hear him behind me, his footsteps uneven as he tried to follow. Where are you going? He called out, his tone now mocking, almost playful. You think you can outrun me? I didn't answer. My legs burned, my lungs heaving as I pushed forward, stumbling over roots and rocks. The sound of his pursuit grew fainter, but I didn't stop until the forest opened up into a clearing, the faint glow of streetlights visible in the distance. I collapsed onto a bench just outside a convenience store, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. My hands were scraped and bloodied, my ankle throbbing from the fall. The clerk inside glanced at me through the window, his expression a mix of concern and confusion. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers shaking as I dialed the police. My voice cracked as I explained what had happened, every detail spilling out in a rush of panic. The operator assured me that an officer would be dispatched immediately, urging me to stay where I was. As I waited, the fear began to morph into anger. How had I let this happen? Should I have confronted him earlier, demanded to be let out? Doubt crept in, but the memory of his questions, his unsettling tone, and the way he'd slowed the car sent chills down my spine. The police arrived quickly, their flashing lights a welcome sight. I recounted the events again, describing the cab and the driver as best I could. One officer nodded solemnly, taking notes, while another drove toward the road where I'd escaped. They found no trace of the cab. The next few days passed in a blur, my routine shattered by the weight of what had happened. Every cab I saw on the street made my stomach twist, the memory of the driver's piercing gaze and mocking tone replaying in my mind. I stayed inside as much as possible, keeping my doors locked and my curtains drawn. Even so, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow that passed my window made my heart race. It was a routine evening, and I was just leaving the grocery store. The parking lot was mostly empty, the last hints of sunlight casting long shadows across the asphalt. I approached my car, juggling a few bags in one hand and my keys in the other, when I noticed it, a folded piece of paper tucked under the windshield wiper. At first, I thought it was a flyer or an ad, the kind people leave to promote their businesses. I set the bags down, unfolded the paper, and immediately froze. The note wasn't a flyer, it was a message, handwritten in neat but hurried script. You bought oranges and bread today, just like last week. Always in the same aisle, always at the same time. My breath caught. My first thought was that it had to be a joke. Maybe someone I knew had seen me and thought it would be funny to mess with me. But as I scanned the parking lot, no one stood out. Just a few scattered cars and an older couple loading groceries into their trunk. I crumpled the note, tossed it into my bag, and climbed into my car. On the drive home, I tried to shake the unease. It had to be a coincidence or a prank, right? Someone bored, someone harmless. But the words stuck with me, unsettling in their specificity. A few days later, the memory of the note had mostly faded. Life was busy, and I had convinced myself it was nothing, a random incident I didn't need to dwell on. That was until the second note appeared. It was taped to my front door. I saw it as soon as I came home, a stark white rectangle against the dark wood. My stomach tightened as I approached, the memory of the first note rushing back. My hands trembled slightly as I peeled it off and unfolded it. This one was even worse. You always turn your lights off at 10:45, except last night, when you stayed up later than usual. Why? I stared at the note, my pulse pounding in my ears. Whoever had written this knew my routines, my habits. This wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't harmless. I scanned the street, my eyes darting to every parked car, every darkened window. The neighborhood seemed quiet, but that only made it worse. Someone had been watching me, close enough to know when I went to bed. That night, I double-checked every lock, drew all the curtains, and left a light on in the living room. Sleep didn't come easily, and when it did, it was fitful and full of shadows. The park had always been my escape, a place to clear my head when life felt overwhelming. I went there regularly, always sitting on the same bench near the pond, where the still water reflected the trees above. It was a space that felt safe. Until it wasn't. I arrived late that afternoon, the chill in the air hinting at an early winter. The bench came into view as I rounded the path, and I immediately noticed something was off. A piece of paper sat on the bench, pinned down by a small rock. My heart sank. I didn't have to open it to know what it was, but I did anyway. The handwriting was the same, unmistakable. October 8th, 3:15 p.m. You stayed here for 22 minutes, staring at the pond. What were you thinking about? I dropped the note as if it had burned me, my breath hitching. They knew my schedule, my habits. They had been here, watching me. I scanned the park, my eyes darting to every figure in the distance. A jogger passed by, their headphones in. A woman with a stroller stood by the swings. No one seemed out of place, yet I felt exposed, vulnerable. Grabbing the note, I left the park quickly. My footsteps hurried and uneven. I didn't look back. After the note at the park, paranoia began to set in. I changed my routines, taking different routes to work and stopping at different stores. I avoided the park entirely, opting for indoor spaces where I felt less exposed. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I started noticing little things. Cars that seemed to follow me for too many turns. Strangers whose glances lingered just a second too long. At home, I kept the blinds shut tight, though it felt like the walls themselves were watching. One night, as I sat on the couch with a cup of tea, the thought struck me. How long had they been watching? The notes referenced patterns, routines I hadn't even realized I had. This wasn't something random, it was calculated. Someone had been tracking me for weeks, maybe longer. I installed a security camera at my front door, hoping it would give me some sense of control, but even that felt like a small comfort against an invisible threat. Whoever was behind the notes seemed to know everything about me, and no matter how careful I was, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were always one step ahead. The next note shattered whatever semblance of control I thought I had. It wasn't left on my windshield or taped to my door. Instead, it appeared somewhere impossibly invasive, inside my work bag. I found it while unpacking after work. The paper was folded neatly, tucked between my laptop and a notebook. My stomach twisted as I unfolded it, recognizing the now familiar handwriting. "You didn't take your usual route to work today, trying to avoid me? Clever, but pointless." I dropped the note, my hands shaking. My breaths came in short gasps as I stared at it lying on the table. My bag had been with me all day. How had they managed to place it inside without me noticing? This was no longer a prank or even simple surveillance. They were close, far closer than I had realized. The thought sent chills racing through me. My home, my car, even my personal belongings, all felt tainted, invaded. That evening, I contacted the police. Explaining the situation to the officer on the phone felt surreal, like trying to piece together a nightmare into something coherent. The officer was sympathetic, but hesitant. "We'll file a report," he said, "but without physical evidence of who's responsible, it's hard to act." I hung up, feeling worse than before. Whoever this was, they knew exactly how to stay invisible. After the report, I took every precaution I could think of. I replaced the locks on my doors and windows, installed more cameras around my property, and began varying my schedule daily. I even took time off work, hoping to distance myself from any predictable habits. And then, as abruptly as they'd started, the notes stopped. Days passed with no new messages. No paper on my windshield, no cryptic letters left in impossible places. The silence should have been a relief, but it wasn't. It felt ominous, like the calm before a storm. Every time I left the house, I half expected to find another note waiting for me, a sign that they were still watching. But there was nothing. The absence of the notes only heightened my paranoia. Had I scared them off by going to the police? Or were they simply waiting, biding their time? I found myself compulsively checking my cameras and my phone, looking for anything out of the ordinary. The unease followed me everywhere. Every unfamiliar car parked near my house felt like a threat. Every glance from a stranger in public sent my heart racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, watching silently, waiting for their next move. One evening, as I was reorganizing my desk, I came across something I hadn't noticed before. A small, unassuming business card tucked into the corner of a drawer. It was blank on one side, but the other bore a simple logo and an address I didn't recognize. At first, I thought it might be unrelated, something I had picked up and forgotten about. But the more I stared at it, the more uneasy I felt. The card wasn't something I remembered owning, and the drawer it was in wasn't one I used often. Had it been left there intentionally? Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. I searched the address online, but nothing came up. No businesses, no residences. Just an empty lot in an industrial area on the outskirts of town. The discovery raised more questions than answers. Was this a clue, a message, or something else entirely? The card felt like a taunt, a reminder that the person behind the notes was always one step ahead. I kept it, unsure if it was wise, but unable to throw it away. Life in my small suburban home was uneventful, and I liked it that way. The neighborhood was quiet, tucked far enough from the city's noise, but close enough to enjoy its conveniences. Nights were peaceful, a time to unwind and let the soft hum of distant traffic lull me to sleep. That is, until the night I heard the knock. It was faint but distinct, echoing through the stillness around midnight. I sat up, heart pounding more from the suddenness than from fear. It was probably a late-night visitor at the wrong house or a gust of wind rattling the frame. Still, I couldn't shake the instinct to check. At the door, I hesitated. My porch light cast long shadows, and the street beyond was empty. No cars, no footsteps retreating into the distance. I opened the door cautiously and peered out. Nothing. The porch was as bare as ever, the neighborhood as silent as the grave. Closing the door, I locked it, telling myself it was nothing. But as I lay back in bed, my mind wouldn't let it go. What if someone had been there? The knocking returned the next night. 2 raps, softer this time, almost testing my reaction. I froze, waiting to see if it would happen again. It didn't. After several tense minutes, I forced myself out of bed, determined to face whatever was causing this. Yet once again, I found only an empty porch and still, silent streets. This pattern repeated for the next several nights. Some knocks were louder, more deliberate. Others were faint, barely audible, as if whoever or whatever was at the door wanted me to doubt myself. I started keeping a flashlight by my bed and made sure every window and door was locked each evening. The paranoia began to seep into my days. I found myself distracted at work, my mind replaying the knocks, dissecting each moment as if I could uncover some logical explanation. Maybe it was kids playing a prank, I reasoned. But the timing was too precise, too methodical, and the silence outside never wavered. By the end of the week, I was double-checking locks before bed and sleeping with a sense of dread. I couldn't deny it anymore. Something wasn't right. When I stepped out to grab the morning paper, I stopped cold. Sitting on my doorstep was a small doll, old and weathered. Its head was missing, the jagged plastic of the neck stark against its otherwise smooth, faded body. It sat upright, facing my door as though someone had carefully placed it there. The sight of it filled me with a sickening unease. Who would leave something like this? A prankster? A neighbor's child? But there were no children in the neighborhood, and no one had been seen loitering nearby. The doll felt personal, as if it were meant for me specifically. I looked around, scanning the empty street, my heart pounding. My hands trembled as I picked it up, half expecting something to happen, though nothing did. I dropped it in the trash bin and slammed the lid, as if doing so could rid me of the creeping dread it brought. But all day, I felt watched. That headless doll haunted me, sitting in my mind far longer than it had sat on my doorstep. The rain came in heavy sheets that night, pounding against the windows and drowning out every sound. I welcomed it at first, thinking the weather would bring relief from the knocking. But the knocks came anyway. 3 sharp raps, louder than they'd ever been, cut through the noise of the storm. I froze in bed, gripping the flashlight with sweaty hands. This time, I didn't hesitate. I bolted out of bed and reached the door in seconds, yanking it open to catch whoever it was in the act. For the first time, I saw movement. A shadowy figure slipped away, disappearing around the corner of the house. My stomach dropped. Someone had been there, and now they were inside. Panic overtook me as I ran through the house, flipping on lights, checking every corner. But there was no one. The doors were locked, the windows secured, yet I knew what I had seen. My rational mind screamed for an explanation. Perhaps it was my imagination, or the rain playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. I wasn't alone in the house anymore. After the shadow and the rain, everything about the house began to feel off. My once comforting sanctuary now felt alien, its walls oppressive and its corners darker than they should be. But it wasn't just a feeling. Things started changing in subtle, terrifying ways. It began with small, almost imperceptible details. A chair slightly out of place, a picture frame tilted on the wall, the faint scent of something unfamiliar in the air. At first I dismissed them as the product of my paranoia, but the more I tried to ignore them, the more undeniable they became. One morning, I found my set of keys not on the kitchen counter where I always left them, but dangling from the lock of the front door. Another day, I discovered the bathroom mirror fogged up, though I hadn't used the shower that morning. At night, the sensations were worse. I would wake to faint creaks coming from the hallway or the soft rustle of fabric, like someone brushing past the door. Each time I mustered the courage to investigate, I found nothing. Yet the weight of being watched pressed on me, heavy and unrelenting. My exhaustion grew unbearable. I barely slept, and my nerves were constantly frayed. I started locking myself in my bedroom, shoving furniture against the door and clutching a heavy wrench for protection. But deep down, I knew these measures were useless. Whatever this was, it didn't care about locks. I came home one evening, soaked from the drizzle that had lingered all day, to find the front door ajar. My stomach sank. I distinctly remembered locking it that morning. Standing on the porch, I hesitated, torn between calling the police or stepping inside. My instincts screamed at me to turn around and leave, but I needed to know what had happened. Pushing the door open, I immediately noticed the chaos. The living room was in shambles. The couch was overturned, the coffee table smashed, and the drawers of my desk spilled their contents across the floor. The headless doll sat in the middle of the room, propped upright as though mocking me. I searched the house, adrenaline coursing through me, every creak of the floorboards making my heart race. But like always, no one was there. The windows were locked, the back door bolted. It was as if the destruction had materialized out of thin air. I spent the night sitting in the car, unable to stay in the house another moment. The rain pelted the windshield, obscuring the view of my front door. I watched it for hours, half expecting to see someone or something emerge, but nothing did. Still, I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. The house had become something else, something hostile. It didn't want me there. With my decision made, I began packing the next day. I worked methodically, keeping myself busy to stave off the dread creeping into my chest. I planned to leave first thing in the morning, hoping to avoid the house's oppressive nighttime atmosphere one last time. That night, I locked myself in the bedroom again, my suitcase packed and ready by the door. I stayed awake, gripping the wrench, my ears straining for the slightest sound. Hours passed, and nothing happened. The silence felt heavier than ever, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. Then, just past midnight, I heard it, a faint, deliberate shuffle, as though someone was walking barefoot across the carpet. The sound came from the hallway outside my room, growing louder with each passing second. I stared at the door, my grip tightening on the wrench, every muscle in my body tensed. The sound stopped directly outside. The doorknob turned. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I just sat there, frozen, staring as the knob rattled once, then twice before going still. Minutes felt like hours as I waited, paralyzed, until finally I heard the footsteps retreating down the hall. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. As the first light of dawn broke through the curtains, I didn't waste a second. I grabbed my suitcase, threw it into the car, and didn't look back. The house loomed in the rearview mirror as I drove away, its empty windows staring after me like dark, unblinking eyes. It was another unremarkable morning, the kind that blurred into countless others. I had boarded the bus, as usual, settling into the same seat I always chose, a window seat midway down the aisle, far enough from the chatter of commuters, yet close enough to the door for a quick exit. The ride was predictable, a quiet hum of engines and the occasional murmur of conversation from the passengers around me. I often passed the time scrolling through my phone or staring out at the passing streets. The bus was half full that day, a mix of regulars and unfamiliar faces. A woman with a sleeping toddler across from me, a businessman typing furiously on his laptop a few seats ahead, and a teenager with headphones who bobbed his head slightly to an inaudible beat. It was normal, comfortable, until it wasn't. I shifted my legs and felt something under the seat. At first, I thought it was my bag, but a quick glance confirmed otherwise. Tucked just out of sight was another bag, a nondescript black backpack with frayed straps and a worn zipper. It didn't belong to me, and no one around seemed to claim it. I looked around for a moment, half expecting someone to lean over and retrieve it, but no one did. The thought of alerting the driver crossed my mind, but something about the bag held my attention. My hand hesitated above it. It looked ordinary, yet it didn't feel that way. Against my better judgment, I pulled it closer. I scanned the bus one more time, heart thumping in my chest. Everyone seemed preoccupied, typing on their phones, staring out the windows, or lost in their own thoughts. If anyone noticed me pulling the bag onto my lap, they didn't show it. My fingers trembled slightly as I unzipped it. The first thing I saw was a stack of papers, folded and slightly yellowed at the edges. I pulled them out, unfolding one to reveal handwritten notes in jagged, hurried script. The words didn't make sense. Snippets of phrases, seemingly random letters, and strange symbols scattered across the page. Some lines were underlined repeatedly, the pen digging into the paper so hard it almost tore. Beneath the papers, I found photographs. They were old, black and white snapshots of people I didn't recognize. Some were of individuals staring directly at the camera, their expressions blank or unreadable. Others were group shots, but something about them felt off. In one, a man stood in the corner of a room, barely visible, his face turned away. In another, a child sat on a swing, alone in an empty park. At the bottom of the bag lay something even stranger, a small notebook covered in symbols similar to the ones on the notes. Its pages were filled with more cryptic writing, like a diary written in code. My breath caught in my throat. None of this felt random. I quickly shoved the items back into the bag and zipped it up, my pulse racing. My initial curiosity had turned into something darker, a creeping unease that I couldn't shake. Who left this here? And why? As I tried to act casual, I couldn't help but glance around. Was someone watching me? Most passengers were still engrossed in their own activities, but I noticed one man near the back of the bus. He was older, with unkempt hair and a coat too heavy for the mild weather. He wasn't looking at me, but his posture felt tense, as if he was waiting for something. I turned away, willing myself to calm down. The bus stopped, and a few passengers disembarked. My eyes darted to the bag, then back to the man. He hadn't moved. The atmosphere felt charged, the normal hum of the bus suddenly oppressive. I decided to push the bag back under the seat. Whatever it was, I didn't want anything to do with it anymore. But the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. As the bus rattled on, I couldn't shake the sensation that someone was observing me. Every rustle of clothing, every cough, every faint sound felt amplified, drawing my attention. I glanced around discreetly, careful not to meet anyone's gaze directly. The man in the heavy coat was still seated near the back, staring straight ahead, but something about his stillness unsettled me. Then, I noticed another passenger, a young woman seated diagonally from me. She was holding her phone, but her eyes flicked toward me occasionally, as though trying to catch my reaction. When our gazes briefly met, she looked away, her movements too hurried to be casual. I leaned back in my seat, trying to appear calm, but my mind raced. Was it paranoia, or did these strangers know about the bag? My thoughts spiraled further when I heard a soft rustling from under the seat. The bag. Was it shifting, or was it just the movement of the bus? I stayed frozen for the remainder of the ride, my hands gripping my knees, my eyes trained on the world rushing by outside the window. The longer I sat there, the more suffocating the atmosphere became. The bag felt like it was radiating unease, drawing attention not only from me but from others around me. I counted the stops until my destination, each one feeling like it stretched into eternity. The bus rattled to a halt at another stop, and a small wave of passengers exited. I watched the flow of people nervously, my heart pounding each time someone moved near the aisle. My stop was still a few stations away, but I couldn't bear the tension any longer. I glanced under the seat where I had pushed the bag. It sat there, innocuous and forgotten by everyone but me, or so I thought. The symbols from the notebook haunted me. I hadn't taken a long look at them, but they were burned into my mind. They reminded me of something I had seen before, an article, a documentary, or maybe even a fleeting conversation. The shapes seemed deliberate, as though they carried a purpose, but one that was deliberately obscured. Suddenly, it clicked. Years ago, I had read an article about esoteric symbols used in obscure rituals. At the time, it had seemed like harmless curiosity, but now those shapes danced in my memory, threatening to unlock something I didn't want to understand. My mouth went dry as I realized how eerily similar these markings were to the ones described in the article. The thought made my skin crawl. Who would leave such things on a bus, and why? I caught myself glancing around again. The man in the heavy coat was still there, unmoving. His presence felt oppressive, though he wasn't looking at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew. My anxiety climbed with each passing second, each sway of the bus as it groaned along its route. I shifted in my seat, desperate for the journey to end. The bus slowed at the next stop, and I braced myself, watching the doors hiss open. A few more passengers shuffled off, and for a moment I thought about leaving too. But as I prepared to move, something stopped me, a figure moving up the aisle. It was a man I hadn't noticed before, dressed in dark clothes, his hood pulled low over his face. He walked purposefully, his strides unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world. My heart froze when he paused near my seat, his gaze dropping momentarily to the bag under it. I held my breath, staring straight ahead, willing myself to be invisible. He didn't pick up the bag. Instead, he stood there for a moment, his body angled slightly toward me. I could feel his presence like a weight pressing against my senses. Then, without a word, he moved further down the aisle and exited the bus. I exhaled shakily, my hands gripping the edge of the seat. My chest felt tight, and my thoughts raced. Was that the owner of the bag? Had he noticed I'd opened it? My mind spiraled with questions, each one more terrifying than the last. I glanced toward the man in the heavy coat at the back of the bus. He was still there, still unmoving. Something was wrong, very, very wrong. The bus continued its journey, each stop bringing me closer to mine. The minutes stretched into an eternity, my every nerve on edge. I avoided looking at the bag but couldn't stop thinking about it. The photographs, the notes, the symbols, they felt heavier now, laden with implications I didn't want to confront. Around me, the bus felt too quiet. The usual shuffle of feet and rustle of bags seemed muffled, the atmosphere oppressive. I stole glances at the other passengers, each one feeling like a potential threat. The young woman with the phone still sat nearby, but now her eyes were fixed firmly on her screen, her previous glances forgotten. The man in the heavy coat had shifted slightly, his head now tilted toward the window, but I couldn't shake the sense that he was aware of me. Every small sound felt amplified. A cough from the front of the bus made me jump, and when the driver announced the next stop, the sound of his voice seemed to echo unnaturally. I counted down the remaining stops, each one marked with a mixture of relief and dread. I was close to freedom, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me, just out of sight. I told myself I would leave the bag behind. It wasn't my responsibility, and I didn't want to know more.